Most people think they know the difference. Cajuns are the swamp people, the crawfish boilers, the accordion players. Creoles are New Orleans, mixed blood, something harder to explain at a dinner party. 2 words, 2 boxes, clean, simple, settled. Except none of that is true, and ancient DNA just proved it in ways that should make every American stop and reconsider everything they were taught about race, identity, and who gets to belong where. In the last decade, genetic studies have begun mapping the ancestry of Louisiana's 2 most mythologized communities with a precision that history books never managed. The lines between Creole and Cajun were never clean. The origins were never simple. And the categories themselves, the ones America spent 2 centuries enforcing with laws and rulers and government pens, turn out to be cultural constructions layered on top of a genetic reality, far older and far more complicated than anyone in power wanted to admit. This is the story of 2 peoples who grew up on the same Louisiana soil, drank from the same rivers, and were told for generations that they were nothing alike. Ancient DNA is now telling a different story. And it starts, as most Louisiana stories do, with France, with Africa, with water, and with survival. The word Creole did not start as a racial category. That is the first thing to understand, and the first thing most people get wrong. When French colonists established Louisiana in the early 1700s, Creole simply meant born here, as opposed to born in Europe or born in Africa. It was geography. A white French planter born in New Orleans was Creole. An enslaved woman born on a Louisiana plantation was Creole. The word belonged to the place, not the bloodline. Cajun has a cleaner origin story, at least on the surface. It is a corruption of Acadian, the French word for Acadian, the settlers who came from what is now Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. They arrived in Louisiana, broken, displaced, carrying everything they owned in memory because everything physical had been taken, a specific people from a specific place with a specific wound. But over time, both words drifted. Creole stopped meaning born here and started meaning something about race, about mixture, about the space between white and black that made Anglo-Americans deeply uncomfortable. Cajun stopped meaning Acadian refugee and started meaning rural, French-speaking, Catholic, poor. Both communities watched their names get redefined by people who were not them, for purposes that had nothing to do with accuracy and everything to do with control. In 1755, the British did something that would echo through Louisiana for 3 centuries. They rounded up French-speaking Catholic settlers from Acadia and expelled them, not quietly, not with compensation. They burned farms. They separated families mid-deportation, loading husbands onto different ships than wives, children onto different ships than parents. History calls it Le Grand Dérangement, the Great Upheaval. Between 10,000 and 18,000 Acadians were forcibly removed. Thousands died from disease, exposure, and shipwrecks. The survivors scattered across the Atlantic world for decades, stateless, landless, defined entirely by what had been taken from them. Then, Louisiana opened a door. The French colonial government, and later the Spanish administration, actively recruited Acadian refugees. They needed settlers willing to work land nobody else wanted. The swamps and prairies of southern Louisiana, where the ground was half water and the summers tried to kill you. The Acadians took it. They had no other offers. What they built in those marshlands was extraordinary. They held their language and their faith like possessions that could not be taxed. And slowly, across generations, Acadians softened in Louisiana mouths until it became something new. Cajun, a people forged from displacement and refusal, planted in the last place anyone expected them to survive, and surviving anyway. To understand what Louisiana was before the Americans arrived, You have to erase everything you know about how race worked in the rest of North America and start over. Louisiana, under French and Spanish rule, had built something that existed nowhere else on the continent. The system had 3 tiers. At the top, white colonists. At the bottom, the enslaved. And in between, something the Anglo-American world had no category for and no patience with. The gens de couleur libres, the free people of color. This middle tier was built into the legal architecture of the colony. The French Code Noir recognized enslaved marriages and allowed freedom to be purchased under certain conditions. When Spain took control in 1763, the Spanish legal code went further still, making manumission easier and granting land rights to free people of color. The result was a class, not a loophole. An actual functioning class of people who owned businesses, educated their children in France, and in 1791 made up more than a quarter of the free population of New Orleans. 1 in 4 free people walking those streets belonged to neither of the 2 boxes America would later insist were the only options. That is the world the Creoles of color built. And it was real. When genetic researchers began studying self-identified Louisiana Creoles in the 2000s, they expected complexity. What they found stopped several of them cold, not because the data was ambiguous, but because it was so specific. The average ancestry profile came back roughly 3/4 sub-Saharan African and about 1/5 European. That alone was not surprising. What was surprising was the European component. It was not the generalized British and Northern European signal that appears in most African American populations across the South. It was French. Specifically, persistently, unmistakably French. The particular genetic markers of French colonial settlers, not English planters, not Scottish merchants. France. The specific country that colonized the specific swamp where these families had lived for 3 centuries. The Native American signal was smaller, typically around 1 to 2%, but consistent across samples. Researchers acknowledged the tools likely undercounted. Indigenous peoples of Louisiana were part of the colonial world from its earliest days, and Creole oral traditions have always carried those connections even when the genetic data has not fully caught up to the memory. 2, 3, and me eventually designated Louisiana Creoles not as a subcategory of another population, but as their own distinct genetic communities. The Florida parishes Creoles, the river parishes and Greater New Orleans Creoles. A genetic identity as particular as the cultural one growing on that same ground for 300 years. The African roots of Louisiana Creole ancestry did not arrive in one wave. That is the detail most tellings flatten into a single sentence. What historian Gwendolyn Midlow Hall spent decades documenting was a layered cultural architecture. 2 distinct African populations deposited into the same colony, a generation apart, each carrying its own knowledge, its own language, its own spiritual framework. The first wave came between 1719 and 1731. More than 6,000 enslaved Africans were brought to Louisiana, predominantly from Senegambia, from peoples including the Bambara, the Mandinka, and the Wolof. These were not anonymous masses. The Bambara brought rice-growing techniques that transformed Louisiana's swamps into productive farmland. They brought musical traditions that would shape rhythms across a continent. They became the founding African population of Creole Louisiana. Then came the second wave. During the Spanish colonial period, roughly 10,000 people were brought from the Congo region. Scholars use a single word to describe what this did to the colony's cultural identity: Congoization. Congolese spiritual practices folded into the existing population. Funeral traditions arrived that still echo in the jazz funerals of New Orleans. That particular alchemy of grief and brass and dancing in the street that exists nowhere else on Earth. Two waves, two distinct African heritages, one colony, and a genetic record that carries both. The Cajun genome tells a different story, but it is no less surprising. When researchers began mapping Acadian and Cajun DNA, they encountered what geneticists call a founder effect, a population bottleneck. The original Acadian settlers were a small, tight-knit group from western France, from regions like Poitou, Saintonge, and Anjou. When the British expelled them, that already small population was shattered further by death and displacement. The Cajuns who settled in Louisiana descended from the survivors, carrying a genetic signature that reflects both their French origins and the narrowing that catastrophe imposed. Geneticists can identify Cajun ancestry with unusual precision because the bottleneck left fingerprints 3 centuries have not erased. But the isolation that defined Cajun communities was never total. Indigenous peoples were neighbors, trading partners, and in many documented cases, family. Native American genetic markers appear in Cajun samples at rates that surprise researchers who expected a purely European profile. The Homa, the Chitimacha, the Atacapa were not background figures in the Cajun story. They were participants in it. And then there is the African thread, quiet in the data but present, a reminder that the boundaries between Cajun and Creole communities were never as sealed as the myth insisted. Before I show you the last part, if you want to look at your own results and see where Creole and Cajun ancestry fits into your bloodline, I put a full 3-volume PDF bundle over at the OriginDNA website. It shows you how to read your raw data and find matches beyond what Ancestry or 23andMe tell you. Link is in the description, but stay right here because what comes next is the part most people completely miss. In 1778, a Catholic priest on the Louisiana frontier called an enslaved woman a public prostitute and sentenced her to be whipped. Her crime was not theft, it was not violence. Her crime was loving a French merchant who had chosen her and bearing him children. Her name was Coincoin. She was 36 years old. She had given birth to more than 10 children, and she had never once been free. When the threat of the New Orleans slave markets became real, the French merchant, Claude Thomas Pierre Metoyer, did not step aside. He bought her, then he freed her. What he gave her was modest. 67 acres of river-bottom land along the Cane River, thick with cypress and cane, bordered by water on one side and wilderness on the other. What Coincoin did with that land was not modest at all. She planted tobacco, though she had never farmed. She trapped bears for their pelts and their grease. She manufactured medicine using knowledge her African-born parents had carried across the Atlantic in their minds because they had been allowed to bring nothing else. By the early 1790s, accounts suggest she was shipping hundreds of bear skins, barrels of bear grease, and thousands of rolls of tobacco to markets in New Orleans. Every dollar beyond survival went to one purpose: buying her children out of slavery, one at a time. By the end of her life, Coincoin owned more than 1,000 acres and had freed several family members from bondage. Her sons built on what she started, raising plantations, founding St. Augustine Church at Isle Brevel, believed to be among the earliest Catholic churches in America, built by and for free people of color, and establishing a community that stretched across 18,000 acres. Her descendants still hold roughly 16,000 of those original acres today. The land itself is testimony, not a monument someone built later. The actual earth, still in the hands of the family that first worked it free. By 1890, that 3-tiered world was gone. The Americans had arrived after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, bringing English, Protestantism, common law, and a racial framework with exactly 2 categories, white or black, no middle, no in between. And then came the case that sealed it. Homer Plessy was 7/8 European, By every visible measure, he appeared white. The East Louisiana Railroad had to be notified in advance that he was legally classified as colored because otherwise not a single person on that train would have known. The Comité des Citoyens chose Plessis deliberately because his body exposed the lunacy of the law. If you had to be told that someone was black in order to segregate them, what exactly were you segregating? The Supreme Court ruled against him 7-1. Plessis versus Ferguson. The decision that would govern American race relations for 58 years was born from a Creole body the law could not see. The legal erasure had a human executor. Between 1949 and 1965, a woman named Naomi Drake served as registrar of the Bureau of Vital Statistics in New Orleans. She kept a list of approximately 250 French surnames she considered suspect. If your name appeared on that list, she would trace your ancestry back 4 or 5 generations, and if she found any prior record marked colored or mulatto, she would change your racial classification, white to Negro. Without notification, without permission. By the time Drake was fired in 1965, she had withheld nearly 5,000 birth certificates and more than 1,000 death certificates. Thousands of lives reclassified by a woman with a pen and a list of French names. Both Louisiana languages nearly died in the same schoolhouse. Cajun French, a living fossil of 17th century French that preserved vocabulary Parisian French, had abandoned centuries ago, survived Le Grand Derangement and the swamps. What nearly killed it was a ruler across a child's hands. Louisiana Creole, known as Courivini, was a separate language entirely, built from West African grammar wrapped around French vocabulary. Spoken across racial lines by anyone who lived in southern Louisiana long enough to belong. Both were beaten out of children for generations. Fewer than 10,000 Courivini speakers remain today, many of them elderly. But something is shifting. Language classes are growing. Musicians are composing in Courivini. In 2023, the first film spoken entirely in the language was produced. Every new speaker is choosing the in-between space deliberately. The culture survived because it was delicious, infectious, and impossible to suppress. Gumbo carries 4 continents in one pot. The word itself likely derives from the West African term for okra. The base is a French roux. The filet powder comes from the Choctaw. The spices carry Caribbean influence. Every family recipe passed down was an act of defiance. Marie Laveau, born a free woman of color around 1801, wielded spiritual, social, and economic power in a world designed to strip her of all 3. She held ceremonies in Congo Square and attended Mass at St. Louis Cathedral, seeing no contradiction, because Louisiana had always understood that survival required holding multiple truths at once. The Congolese funeral traditions became jazz funerals. The accordion and washboard became zydeco. The middle space became jazz itself, the art form that would define the 20th century, born from the category that was not supposed to survive. We started with 2 words. Ancient DNA has now made the old assumptions impossible to hold. The genetic data shows layered, specific, historically particular people whose ancestry reflects every collision that happened on Louisiana soil over 3 centuries. The Senegambian founders and the Congolese second wave. The Acadian refugees carrying their bottlenecked French genome through a generation of displacement. The indigenous neighbors whose presence shows up even when the tools undercount it. The French colonial signal so specific it names a country, not a continent. None of this was confusion. These were people who built languages and cuisines and spiritual practices and legal identities and literary anthologies under penalty of death, who held land when land was the only argument a pen could not take, who put a man who looked white in a railroad car to show the Supreme Court the face of its own absurdity. The DNA did not create these identities. It confirmed them. The middle was never a compromise. It was never passing. It was a homeland. And it was real the whole time, written into the double helix, waiting for someone to finally read it. The history is on the map, but it's also in your code. To unlock it, check out the Origin DNA at the link below. It's a 3-volume PDF guide bundle that walks you through reading your raw data, mastering your matches, and tracing your deepest origins. Don't settle for surface-level test results. Click the link below and get your bundle.